Introduction to Validation. He's carrying on the work of his dad. He's done the website. He's produced videos. He's just carried on. And I'm truly proud of my whole family. I'm truly proud of them. I'm so grateful that they are here and that they are what they are. Thank you.
Do you want to say anything to Ed?
Pardon?
Do you want to say anything to Ed?
To Ed? Did I not mention you?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Ed is so much a part of me, and I don't want to thank me. So. Well, without Ed, there would be no validation. I think everybody knows that. That it was his film, When Generations Meet, that we made in 1972, and the Office on Aging, which was just started by the state of Ohio, saw it. It was a film where I was training the high school dropouts to work with the residents at Montefiore Home, and they put it on TV, and the head of the Office on Aging saw it, and she called me and said, I'd like you to do a workshop, because they were just starting training at that time on aging. And I said, oh, and she wanted me to travel like 3 hours. And I said, oh, I can't do that because my kids were still little. And I hung up, and she gave me her phone number, and I said to Ed, I can't do that. And he said, now you call her right back, and you tell her that you're going to do it. And that's how it started.
Back up a little bit and tell us how you met Ed.
Oh.
How that started.
I had just been divorced and came with 2 little girls to Cleveland from New York. And my parents, who were the directors of Montefiore Home, Ed was a professional filmmaker, and they had hired him years ago to make a film. And they wanted to update it. So they invited the board of directors, because they needed their approval, to come to a dinner, and invited Ed to show the film. And I was sitting next to him, because I'd just come back from New York. And Ed asked me, do you go biking? And I said, sure, I go biking. I hadn't ridden a bike in, 15 years. I was about 30 then, and it was about 16 that I'd ridden a bike. So after I asked my mother, where's my bike? And she had kept it in the garage all those years. So I never saw Ed in long pants after that until we got married, because we always went biking. And that's how I met Ed. And then the board approved the film, and we made our first film called Where Life Still Means Living, film on Montefiore Home, in which Beth, the woman I wrote the script, and Beth, the lady, the heroine, had a dementia. She was time confused, and she looked out of the window and she said, oh, there I am. I'm 5 years old in my red dress. And Ed panned out, and there was Beth bouncing the ball, and I still have that red dress.
Oh.
And so she was in our first movie, and then Vicki was in our next movies, right? In a World of Aphasia, where he said, Margie is dead. Sibling rivalry, huh? But anyway, remember that one? Mm-hmm. So that's how I met Ed. If it wasn't for that film, Where Life Still Means Living, people wouldn't have known about my work, because people saw that film, and then they called me, and I had groups, and they came from very far to see my groups. And then psychiatric hospitals and nursing homes and so on started to be very interested.
Well, tell us more about your years at Montefiore, those years when you were working, what you learned and didn't learn, your struggle.
Well, I was thinking of what else I learned. Well, I learned from Isidore Rose, but I think everyone might probably know that. The mistakes that I made, I had a very Freudian background, and I was trying, and I was trained as a group worker. At that time, the psychiatric group work, to work with small groups. They don't do that anymore. But anyway, I was trying to give insight to people, to get them to express their emotions. I was trying to analyze them in a sense. And one man whose name was Isidore Rose said my father was castrating him in the attic. And I was trying to get him to express his emotions, and he withdrew from me. Later, I found out that his father had locked him up in the attic, and that my father was a symbol of his father, but he didn't want insight. He just wanted to get out his anger. And very slowly, I learned that I had to give up a lot of what I had learned in school and accept the people where they were, and that just by listening to them. As Mr. Rose has, expressed his anger, he felt better.
Did you have conflicted emotions about that? Here you had this academic background that said it's this way, and your real life experience is showing it's something else. It seems like that would be a tension in you.
I think
internally.
there was. And for a while, I was very, I thought, oh, research and academia, because I was very academic as a young person. But then I went to a lot of conferences, and I saw them giving papers, the researchers. And I realized that these papers didn't have that much substance to them.
They didn't fit the reality.
They didn't.
Reality you were living.
And so slowly I gave up the academic stuff and started working with the people.
Trusting what was happening.
Trusting, that's right, trusting the people.
So you said you wanted to tell us about how you left Montefiore.
Well, that was sad.
Yeah.
And I looked for my old papers, and I found a paper where and this was scribbled, that said, Mrs. Godlich's clothes were torn, Mrs. Kessler didn't have her teeth in, and a whole big list of people that were neglected. And I tried, the administrator was, at that time in the 70s, had hired a new psychiatrist who was medicating everybody. And I couldn't even do my group because the people were sleeping, because they were medicated. And in the middle of my group, the nurse would come and take them out to give them more medications. And, I would bring, no one would give me any, in a group you have refreshments, and it's very important because it gives people rolls. And I had to buy the refreshments, which I did. The administrator took them out of the refrigerator. And I looked for them, I went to get them, and they were gone. He took away my office. This went on for several years. So finally, in 1979, I wrote a letter to the head of the board saying I had to leave. And this administrator wrote me a letter back saying, we understand that you have to leave because of all your other commitments, because I had started doing workshops at that time. And I said, I didn't leave because of any other commitments. I would never leave the people. I love the people. I'm leaving because I can't work anymore because of the administration, because you don't care, you give lip service. But you don't really care about the people, and I can't work here. People are getting restrained. Mrs. Kessler, whom I worked with, I asked Ed, they were doing reality orientation, I think most of you know this, and I wanted to show that reality orientation didn't help the people. So I asked Ed to come and film my group, and he did. And you saw Mrs. Kessler, being restrained and saying, "Don't do that." And I showed this to the board. I only did that to show to the board, to show them how bad it was. And as punishment, the head nurse put Mrs. Kessler in a jerry chair and would not let her get up at all. And in just a week, she became a living dead person. And she always wanted to get out of that chair. And we have that on movie film, too. So I couldn't stay there anymore because she was punishing me by restraining the people. But it was after that film, which was where Life's Looking for Yesterday, the ombudsman saw the film, and they saw Mrs. Kessler pleading, and that's when they stopped restraining people. So Ed's films had a big impact on this whole business of restraints. And that was in the 70s. But then I had to leave Montefiore. I couldn't work there.
So did you keep working with residents for a little while after
I did. I worked in 2 nursing homes as a group worker, and we put on plays. I used the drama and so on.
Yeah.
But then I started doing more and more workshops.
So tell us about going on the road and what memories come to the surface. I see you've got an interesting note there.
Which one?
It says, well, first, let's talk about how you already mentioned that how word of mouth got around and you started getting speaking engagements. How did you get to Canada?
Well, I did a workshop in America. It was a national conference on aging, I think, and there was a sister, Giovanni Burroughs, from Vancouver. And she saw me, and she called me, and I went. This was a Catholic home, and I stayed there. I stayed with the nuns for a while, and that was a lot of fun.
Really?
We drank a lot of wine, and I was there on Halloween.
Oh, my.
It was,
Really?
Yeah, right. And well, anyway, and I did a lot of workshops in Canada, throughout Canada, and a nurse came who was Dutch, and she wrote an article which was published in the Canadian Nurse, the difference between validation and then it was called fantasy therapy. It didn't have the word validation yet.
And validation was called fantasy therapy?
Yeah, because I was teaching then at a college, and people said, you need a name for what you're doing. And I called it group work with disoriented old people. And they said, no, you need a name for it. And then one of the Plain Dealer, which is our local newspaper, wrote an article in which the headline was, Fantasy is an Arm for Therapy at Montefiore. So I said, hey, we'll call it fantasy therapy. And then we showed the film that Ed made, and a researcher, Ben Dana, saw the film, and he came to me and he said, no one is going to research anything that you call fantasy therapy, and you need this to be researched. What you're doing is validating the people, and that's how the word validation came. I said, okay, I don't care what you call it. So, and that's how validation came about.
Wow.
Yeah.
So from Canada, did that lead to other international?
Yeah, the
work?
Canadian nurse who was Dutch wrote this article, and then she had a friend who read it, and he translated it into Dutch. And then someone from Apeldoorn in Holland saw it, and he was having a big jubilee for his nursing home, and he called one day. I picked up the phone, and here was this man from Holland, said, would you like to come to Holland? And I said, sure. And I think, Vicki, were you there yet? Vicki had...
I was in Vienna.
She was in Vienna then. So anyway, so then I came to Holland. And then, of course, Vicki was in Vienna, and she organized a workshop when her little girl, Lena, was just born. And that was really my first workshop in 1989, I think it was. 88? And 89, something like that. Lena was just an infant. Yeah. And so I worked in Germany and in Vienna for a long time. And at that time, I could not speak German. And I had a translator. His name was Heinrich, but he fell asleep. So I would be talking away, and pretty soon there was this silence. And there was Heinrich, fast asleep. So I was really motivated to learn German. But so I would ask my translators to write down the words that I didn't know so that I could learn German. So I spoke more and more of my workshops in German, not all of them. But I still, they still were translating me until one day I was doing a workshop, and very casually the guy said, I don't have a translator. And I said, what? He said, how can I do that? I can't do that all in German. He said, well, it's too bad. And that was when I started. That was Tietz.
Whoa. Talk about dumping the sink or swim.
Yeah,
Wow.
right. And
What
so,
is
but he was good, because that's when I started to do it in German. I had to.
What is this suicide on the story?
When I first went to Holland, this lady was supposed to meet me. And the train someone committed suicide. A lot of people were doing that at that time. And of course the train stopped, and I saw the body being wrapped up and all the blood on the tracks, and we all had to get out, and I didn't know where I was. We were supposed to go to, and I had just, this is my first trip, I think, to Europe.
That's scary.
It was scary, and everyone knew where to go, but I didn't know. There was a little town, and I didn't know where I was, and the guy wasn't helpful at all. And I called, and I think I finally called. You weren't in Holland then, I guess. I don't know, but how I got there, I don't know. Because nobody helped me. I was totally...
Oh, God.
Other people took the bus or another train. But so those were some of the experiences that I had.
What about the sauna in the castle?
Oh, this was in, I think, Gelsenkirchen? Who's here from Germany? Anyway, it was where the Americans had troops for many years during the war, the American Army. And there was a castle. It was way up on a hill. And they had a beautiful sauna. And so I went into the sauna, and I was having a great time. And I took all my clothes off, and I hear these two GIs talking from a distance, and they were coming closer and closer. And I thought, what am I going to do? I didn't want them to see me naked. I was much younger then. So I said, this is not a place for our Americans here. You must go away. And they went away. So I was safe.
And you tell me about going to look for where your father was born.
Oh, yeah. I was just thinking, in trains in Holland, when I'm at that, I was going from Denmark to Holland on a train, and this was right after the wall came down, and I was sleeping, and I woke up, and everything was gone. My passport, and I had just sold books at that time. My books weren't translated. So I had all the book money that I had, all my money that I had, all the passports, everything completely gone. They had sprayed me with a gas. I woke up, I remember, and they sprayed me, and I went back to sleep. And they took everything. Oh. And I went to the police station, and the policeman said, well, you know you shouldn't go to sleep in Hamburg. There was no sign that said don't go to sleep in Hamburg. Because, you know, there were gangs at that time right after the wall. People came from the east. And there was someone on this train, one of the conductors, who knew this little gang, because when I went to the police station, I wasn't alone. Every woman who was alone had been robbed on this train. And that was right after the war. So it's another experience.
How did you get out of that?
I went to Vicky. I saw Vicky, and she took me. And Lena was little, or Katie was just born, and took me to the embassy because I didn't have a passport, and I had to get back to the U.S. to do a workshop the very next day. And I had a commitment. So Vicky helped me get a passport through the embassy because her husband was worked for the diplomatic service. So I was able to get another passport. That's how I got out of that.
Did you want to tell us about Steinsford?
Yeah, my father was born in Steinsford, which is a very little town that nobody ever know about. And I always asked, when I went to work in Germany, where is Steinsford? And everybody said, there is no Steinsford. It's Schweinsfurt. And I said, no. I looked on the map. I saw the Schweinsfurt, but there's no Steinsford. Well, I did a workshop at one place, and the translator, who was very nice, said, where are you going? And I said, I'm going to Heidelberg. And I thought, Heidelberg, because my father always wanted to be a medical doctor, but he didn't have enough money. He had to be a PhD. So, and I knew he wanted to go to Heidelberg, and I knew that Heidelberg was not far from Steinsfurt. So when the guy picked me up, that took me to Heidelberg, I said, did you ever hear of a town called Steinsfurt? And he said, no. But after the war, they combined these little towns. So if we go out in this Autobahn, maybe there is a Steinsfurt, because there was a Sinsheim, which was a bigger town. So we went out, and sure enough, there was a town, Steinsfurt, and they were having a big jubilee or something, and the mayor, the Burgermeister, was there. And I know my mother had said that there was a Julius Weil Street, and that was my father's name, Julius Weil. My name is Feil, but his name is Weil. Changed one letter, but anyway. That was just an accident. But so he asked the Burgermeister, is there a Julius Weil Street? And the Burgermeister said, well, I don't know, but you go to that house, and Mr. Appenzeller, in that yellow house, he knows all the Jews that lived in Steinsfurt. So he was very nice. He took me to the house, and there were Mr. and Mrs. Appenzeller coming down the hill, and Mrs. Appenzeller saw me, and she said, Matilda! Now, Matilda was my father's mother, whom I never knew, because she never wanted my father to marry my mother because they were too poor. But I knew that was her name. And when Mrs. Appenzeller was a little girl, my Matilda Weil, my grandmother, whom I never met, used to go shopping in the grocery store of Mrs. Appenzeller's parents. And so she saw me, and I guess I must have looked just like Matilda. And so she said, Matilda. And so wow. That's how I knew Steinsfurt. And so Mr. Appenzeller showed me where my father lived and the cemetery where my grandfather was buried. And then later, my children, and Eddie is named for Gustav, which is my grandfather's name, we all went back there and saw the grave and where my father lived. It's interesting because I found out that my father's family sold cows. Now, we always lived in a city. We never knew anything about a country. And Eddie went to Oregon, and he now has a farm with cows. So figure that one out. But anyway, does that make sense?
That's a great story.
Yeah.
So how did you go? You went first to Europe, and now you've got Japan and Australia, New Zealand.
Well, Japan came through Finland.
Oh.
The people from Germany went to Finland, and they brought my book with them, and that's how I got to Finland. But then, a man from Japan went to Sweden because he wanted to know how nursing homes were, because he had heard they were so good. And he went to one nursing home, and he saw a worker. He saw an old lady on the floor in a fetal position, and the worker was doing mirroring and singing with her, and the lady's eyes opened, and they had communication. So Jinri, who was the Japanese man, asked the worker, what were you doing? How did you get her to wake up like that? And she said, I was doing validation. And he said, what's that? And then he went to Health Professions Press and got my book, and then they translated it into Japanese, and then they called me. At first somebody else, a broker, called me, because Jinri thought he couldn't, he heard I was Jewish and I would never come to Japan and eat yearly. So this broker, for a long time, this broker, and they broker charged him a lot of money for nothing, you know, because he could have called me directly. And he thought that I wouldn't eat the food. But the last time I was in Japan, we went out to a restaurant, and you know, we had fish, and I was eating this fish, and I look and I see this squid on the table, and the squid's eyes were closing. It was alive. And I said, I just ate a fish and it's still alive. And they said, very fresh, Naomi-san, very And they had their cameras all ready to get my expression. So I eat live fish.
Tell us about the Australian, the side trip, and then I'm going to turn and ask the audience to share some stories.
Well, I was in Australia, and the man who had hired me had another job. So he said, you can't go on anymore here. And I had a ticket, and it was a frequent flyer ticket, and I couldn't leave earlier. So he said, well, go to Indonesia. It's cheap, you know, it won't, and you'll have a lot of fun. So I went to Ubud, which is in Indonesia, and they gave me a little house way up on a hill. And I went there, and I heard these noises, like that. And I asked, they have a houseman, and I asked, what is that noise? And he said, well, if you meet me at 4 o'clock in the morning, but you have to he made me wear the sari, and I will show you, but don't tell anybody when you have to go very quietly out, and I'll meet you outside of the gate.
And you did that?
I did it. I went very
Does she have guts
quietly
or no?
outside of the gate, and there he was. And I'm trying to think of his name. But at any rate, and we walked for many miles, and we saw the sun come up. We walked through all the little towns, little villages, and where the cocks were crowing, and the men were getting the cocks ready for the big fight, which was really terrible. I saw the fight where they slash so that they can fight each other. And the dogs were barking, and he told me that the dogs were barking because I was white, and the dogs could smell that wherever we went, all these dogs started barking. But I saw the ladies come up, the young girls with the water on their heads, carrying the water. People were just getting up. It was really, and then they have this, they have pigs, which they revere. And there was this trough in the middle as you're walking so that the pigs could have water. And I had this long sari thing. And I was walking and I fell right into where the pigs fall. And soaking wet. So he took me, this guy, to his family. And they took all my clothes off. But at that time, the women didn't wear clothes. They just wear bottoms, but no tops. And I was sitting there, and his wife was fanning me and drying me off. And we did finally get to where all this noise was. And what it was, hundreds and hundreds of farmers were going, hey! They were hitting the birds who were taking their rice, because their rice had just come up, and the birds were getting at the rice. So they had these long sticks, and they were yelling, hey, hey! And that was the noise, which had filtered through all these miles.
Wow.
And that was that story.
Wow,
it was really nice time.
So let's change pace, yes?
We forgot Ed's video.
Ed's video. Okay.
Naomi's life Ed's video.
Uh-huh. Okay, you want to show it now? Okay. Yes, you're on. Sorry, I didn't have that on my notes. I'm sorry about that.
Please.
I'd like to see.
One second. Set him over. Is there a mic for those speakers? Here. No? Sure. Let's try this. Okay.
I understand that some of you in the audience have some stories about a road warrior here, about her trials and travails on the road. Is Fran here? Yeah, would you like to start?
I don't know if this is specific to road. Can you hear me?
Why don't you come up here?
Here's a microphone, maybe this one.
If you stand by her, you could speak.
No, I can give it to her. Well, can I do that?
It's okay. You hold on to that one.
I'll hold on.
How's that? Is that better? I can't even tell. I'll just project, okay? All right. At first glance, Naomi Feil resembles a typical older woman, quite easy to dismiss. Her white hair, wrinkled face, big glasses which have been replaced recently by stylish glasses, framing her now cataract-free eyes, arthritic hands, prosthetic hips, hardly rate a second glance by the casual observer. She could be anyone's grandmother, kind, gentle, warm, caring. But spend a little time with Naomi Feil, and you will find out how extraordinary she is. How chameleon-like her appearance can shift. How transformative her personality becomes when she talks about validation. Naomi Feil is not your average senior citizen from Shaker Heights, Ohio. She is an articulate, dynamic, international star in the world of geriatric dementia care. She is an accomplished actress and educator, weaving her ideas into her practice. If you have had the privilege of watching Naomi demonstrate her validation techniques in a workshop, you have no doubt shared my astonishment as she seamlessly morphs into those memory-impaired individuals she is best at serving. 1 minute, she is Mrs. Jones, who waits anxiously at the door each afternoon for a visit by a husband taken from her 20 years before. Another minute, she's Mrs. Smith, whose dizzying head bobbing and hand motions accompany rhythms only she can hear. Naomi can be the wanderer or the time traveler at any given moment. And most amazingly, she's able to share her remarkable gifts with people for whom traditional interpersonal communication has been lost in languages as diverse from her own as Swedish and Japanese. I have seen her work her magic not only with the Mrs. Joneses and Mrs. Smiths of the world, but also with their frustrated caretakers, both professional and lay. She opens doors that had been shut. She spans bridges across vast divides and brings comfort and joy to those lives she touches. I'm so honored to have been her colleague at the Validation Training Institute since 1989, and I've watched the phenomenal impact Naomi's ideas and techniques have had around the globe. I have also been privileged to be her friend these 23 years and to get to know her wonderful family. On behalf of the VTI board and from my own heart, please join me in celebrating a woman who is 80 years young, Naomi Feil.
Does anyone else have a story, a memory they'd like to share of when Naomi was in your town? Did you have something about Scott you wanted to?
Well, Scott Averill over there and Jennifer, I think Scott knows, has a wonderful story of how he first met me. But I remember he asked me to do a workshop somehow, and then I didn't hear from him. Then I called him one day, and I wasn't sure I wanted to go, and he said, well, you can come to Leavenworth, because there's a big prison in Leavenworth, Kansas. And I said, okay, I want to see this prison in Leavenworth. And, do you remember that conversation?
I do. I'll share my story really briefly. I was a new administrator, knew hardly anything, and I had begun working in a facility, and Jennifer Carpenter here was our activity director. And I saw a conference, and I asked Jennifer if she wanted to go to that conference, and she did, and it was like a 2 or 3 day national activity directors conference, as I recall. And she comes back, and she comes marching into my office, and she has a book in her hand, and she slams this book down on my desk, and she goes, you know that conference you sent me to? And I'm like, yeah. And she said, this book, I saw this lady, and she wrote this book, and she was crazy. She was just crazy, but what she said made sense. And I think I know what we need to do with Josephine and Edna and Nellie and the names of our confused residents. And being the good administrator that I was, I didn't read that book right away. But a little later, when I was leafing through the book, I literally was just going through the pages, and there was a phrase on one of the pages that just like jumped off at me. And it was the simple phrase, you must be firmly grounded in your reality so that you can freely travel in theirs. And for me, that was a light bulb that just opened up a whole new world for me. Because I personally, was frustrated working with our confused residents. I saw many of my coworkers who were very frustrated, and we began, we asked Naomi to come to the prison and lead a workshop, and that just, led one thing to another. Jennifer and I started leading a group, and we just saw this amazing transformation. And I remember somehow the local journalist from the Leavenworth paper came out and sat in one of our groups and took literally right in the middle of the group. And I remember her taking pictures, and she calls me late that night, like 11 o'clock, and she goes, that was the most incredible experience. And she's like gushing with all these words, and she goes, I thank you for, inviting me. And she comes out, there was a paper, I think it was the Sunday paper, the biggest day publication, and it's a banner headline about, validation, and it was a great article of me sharing her experience. So,
Thank you.
the last thing I want to say is I've been in this field now for 23 years, and I've said this to many, many people, and I just want to say it here in a public setting. 23 years I've been in this field. I would not have been in this field for 3 years had it not been for running across you, Naomi, and your work. So thank you very much for my career.
I know you mean that. And I do think Michael, a leader, is he here? Because he had the guts to hire Vicky when reality orientation was still a very prominent, and to begin validation. And can you tell who the lady? Forgot her name. And she saw me working. We were touring the home, and she went away somewhere. And there was this one resident who was climbing the walls or something. And I went over to her and I just did what I always do. And she went and told you. Do you remember that?
Well, Naomi, I'm a few years older than Scott, and my memory is not as sharp as his. Rita, do you remember that?
Was it you, Rita?
I remember when I was first interviewed for Country Meadows with Michael, and he asked me if I knew of you and your work, and I had to regretfully but honestly say, no, not much. I know of validation, but honestly haven't read much, or, and then that's when you said you were inviting Naomi to do some seminars. And I had the pleasure of picking you up at the airport and spending time with you while you traveled to the different Country Meadows campuses. And watched you in action, because there was a woman sitting at a table crying and pounding the table and saying, where is he? Where is he? That son of a said he'd never leave me, and he left me, and he left me, and he said he'd never leave me. And I went over because I knew her from a prior job I had from a daycare center I worked at, and I tried this. It's going to be okay. God loves you so much. I'm a nurse. I tried to put a big Band-Aid on it. And Naomi was standing there, and I knew it wasn't working, and I kind of went like that and backed away, and Naomi then came in and said, he left you here, and you don't want to be here, and you validated her. And you then told me that what we should, of course, never do is place a resident at a table without a meal and without a friend, and you touched her face, and you used mother touch, and you caressed her, and you validated that he shouldn't have left her. And she stopped crying. She had a trusted listener. She had a friend. And as I walked away, or started to, you then looked around and found a resident that sort of just walked around like this all day and never spoke. Walked over to him and said, sir, can you help me? And he raised his head. And I bet you were the first person that asked him to give help in years. And you said, this lady is missing her husband. She needs someone like you to sit with her. And you took her hand and you took his hand and you showed him how to sit down and just be her friend. And as we walked away, I was a bit skeptical about that, I must admit. This might last about a minute and a half. But you toured the rest of the floor, and as we were ready to leave, I remember I ran back to see, and there he was.
Still there.
Wow.
And from then it's history, because Michael opened the door and he knew about you, he invited you, and then really the next day Michael was signing on the dotted line to become an NAVA.
Thank you, Rita. I remember all that now. I just want to say, our family this year is celebrating our 50th year in the senior living profession. And we, like you, Naomi, wanted to make life better for seniors. And during the first years, we tried to do things. And I think we were pretty effective, and as many providers were, in improving the physical well-being of people with physical therapy and occupational therapy and better diets and medications and exercise and so forth. But we were not making any progress in helping people who needed, who were socially and emotionally challenged. And we were trying different things. We tried, someone mentioned reality orientation therapy. Was that you, Scott? We tried that. We tried remotivation therapy. And I even went to meet with a doctor in South Carolina who was working with hyperbaric oxygenation chambers with people who had Alzheimer's. And when I got there, I realized he had drawn the conclusion that there was no benefit of that. But we didn't realize really what was happening to people in those days. And I think it was in 1978 that I came to one of your workshops. I don't remember where it was, but I do remember the workshop. And it opened my eyes to a different way of dealing with people who had the challenges of memory loss, dementia.
Thank you.
And that, at that time, I never anticipated that we would be training all of our direct caregivers in validation therapy, as we're attempting to do today. Nor that we at Country Meds would be the longest serving AVO in the United States. And I'm grateful to all those who have worked with us in developing our expertise, and especially to you and Vicki. You, like our family, are sort of a family business. Your husband and you and your daughter and your son and perhaps even your grandchildren will be carrying on this tradition. And if it weren't for you and people like Rita and Steve Klotz and Joan Edgar and Maureen Sirianni and Sandy Strathmar, who had been with us until a couple of years ago, and who have I missed here today? Jim Day and Jana, who has been our faithful administrative supervisor there. We wouldn't have an AVA. We wouldn't be an AVA. They're the ones who have been the feet on the ground, who've been the practitioners and the teachers of this therapy. And I know Steve, in particular, Steve has been on the West Coast. He's been here in Minneapolis. He's been in Texas teaching, and where else, Steve?
North Carolina.
North Carolina. Or in the summer he goes to North Carolina. And I'm grateful to all of them. I'm proud of all of them. I'm proud of the role that we have played through you with our help, with your help, to be teachers of this marvelous therapy that you have developed. And as I thank you for this little book that you provided us, I see your cards in it, so I thank you. And there are two quotes that I would like to share with you. One is on the program. Treasure the one who lightens the burden of anyone else. And if all of you read that, you have certainly done that. Not only for those who have suffered from the, I likened it to being in a prison. People in a prison without anyone to communicate with. Worse than being in prison because they had no one to talk to. You have provided a key to the door of that prison. That has not only helped those who have benefited from validation themselves, but their caregivers and their friends and their loved ones and those staff members who were frustrated and saddened and burned out by dealing with people for whom they had no way to communicate with. So thank you so much for lightening their burden, for lightening our burden. We're forever in your debt, Naomi. Happy birthday.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We're slightly over the broadcast time, but before we close that, I want to turn the floor over to Steve.
I do want to say something
Oh,
about
yes.
Rosemary. I don't want to leave
Oh,
here
okay.
without thanking Rosemary for all she has done. And she has really taken Mrs. Goglik and Mrs. Kessler and Florence Lou, her real name Florence Lou, into her heart, and has given these people life. You have done that. And it's like something blossoming and growing and growing. And I do want to thank you. Also want to thank Paula, because this was way in the beginning when I was doing a workshop for the Adult Protective
Well, you're talking about El Paso or
in El Paso.
APS?
Yeah, say what you did.
Well, I encountered her in El Paso, and it made, all of a sudden, it made me understand, oh, we need this, because we were working with adults and elderly people in the community who had dementia, and we had no clue what to do, and this was a way to find out what was going on and to relate to them. So I brought her back to Texas to train our staff in adult protective services.
And she brought me to the Gray Panthers.
And we brought her back to
Yeah.
Texas every year or two for about 20 years.
People take me to the airport that were in their 90s. And I had to be at the airport 2 hours, 3 hours. So the oldest person with the worst eyes,
And deaf.
10
and
minutes before. And he would be driving, and I said, we have to get there. And he said, whoa, Nellie, whoa.
He could, and he was deaf as a post.
Yeah,
Okay.
he took me to the airport.
Only once, right? We didn't do that again, right?
Another one, what I learned, and that was in the adult protective, at that time, I wore a wig, and I was in my late 40s, early 50s, and I guess I was overacting. So I was acting, and I wasn't being the person. And I asked at the end of my workshop, I said, are there any questions? And this man raised his hand, and I said, yes. And he said, why do you yell so loud? So that taught me, that you have to be internal, not external. So I've learned a lot. And I also wanted to thank Dave and Wayne for their guts, because this took a lot of courage to support validation at a time when it is not popular, when reality orientation and redirection, diversion and all that is a thing to do. And also Katya, who started M&R, took a lot of courage to do all that. And so this is, I think it's the people that I've worked with, that you are bringing to life. I'm not thinking that. So anyway, I want to thank you.
Okay.
I would like to say something. It's underground of the traveling. And I want to share something with everyone, because I used to take Naomi to the airport, and sometimes we had problem with the luggage, because 3 times Naomi arrived and has no luggage to do a workshop. So if we are in a place where my parents live, it's very easy, because my mother took her to a closet and offer some dress and so on. But one time I was we were very late to go to the airport, and we were in the Vosges, so it's the mountains, and I took the way I knew, and I was very calm, because I know how to center myself, even if I have somebody very stressed with me. And I took, there was a
Traffic jam?
traffic jam, and I took another way, and down this way, we had 2 policemen say, go there. Did you see the speed? I said, yes. No, I didn't. It's 15 and you were at 50 and you were at 70. I said, yes, okay. But I have somebody to take to the airport. And they say, okay. come with me and do what we have to do. I say, oh, the lady is not so young, and I think she will be very stressed in a few moments. And so I said, I want you to go very fast. And he said, I take the time that I need. I say, okay, do what you want. And then suddenly I saw Naomi come out of the car and begin to cry. Say, I want to have my plane, let me go, please. And I said, wow. We were on the road. I just told you have to. And the policeman said, okay. And because she looks very bored. So I said, you will see, she cannot, said, can you calm her? I said, no. I said, perhaps later, but there's no possible, no solution. So he very quick, and then we came back in the car, both, and I began to drive, and then she said, okay, Katya, did I do well? And she just had, I stopped at the moment because I was afraid. It took me to the jail.
Wow, go ahead, Steve.
Thank you for all you've done, and it's a real pleasure, and you learn so much to us, Benedict and me, and you told so much. You told, I think, and you told so much. Excuse me for my English, but it was it's really a big part of our life, and Anna knows that very well.
Thank you for sharing.
I began with validation.
I'll just say a couple words now, and I'll say the other things that I have toward the end of the dinner program. We'll transition to that here in just a moment. You realize that everyone who is here is, many people have come from a distance. All of us have put up with some technical problems this afternoon, and that happens when you try to put together something that's big and impressive, because we want to impress you. Last night at the NAVA dinner, you said something like, you all have made my life worthwhile. We're here because you have made our lives worthwhile. And I'll say more about that later. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to Rosemary.
I see that we should have had a weekend of celebration. So it was very, very short time for me, and I looked and it's 4 o'clock, and people were asked to be here to provide supper for us, so they have fulfilled that. But what I have on the table there, the people that were on the call, the conference with us, and some that couldn't be, we extended to them the opportunity to send a message to Naomi. And so these are in this book for you, and a number of photos as well. And with that in mind, and I thought we had more time, but you can find time maybe in between here. I'll bring some paper to your table and a pen, and this book we'll put over there, there's a little more space over there. And there are still some pages, but I will put it in plastic sheet protectors for you, Naomi, and there are some of those empty. You can put yours right in, and if you come and they're all filled, stick it in the pocket and we'll fill this up.
So if you want to add to the messages, be our guest.
Yes, because the time has run out when we wanted to hear some more from you too, and from you. So here's the avenue. And I would suggest they are ready for us. So maybe who's ever ready, just keep moving, or if you have anything that you'd like to get rid of from your table.
Have we finished the broadcast, turned off, tell them goodbye?
Must be, I think so.
Okay. Thank you for joining us.
you.